Here is the story of a temple from 1950 built by Holocaust survivors and a few Americans.
I remember my mother saying, "Where have you brought me?" All that was around her were tall grasses and fields, and it was a very hard life.
We knew people here who had tattoos on their arms and knew the stories of them surviving death camps.
Coming here when I was a little boy, and all these Holocaust survivor farmers, they didn't have a cantor or a rabbi really, and they all took turns, chanting. It was something to see. It really was.
The people were able to come alive again after the war, especially the immigrants, the Holocaust survivors.
I remember my mom talking about people coming up to her and handing her $1. This is for the temple.
You've heard stories of folks who donated some of their livestock to be able to help raise money because they didn't have money directly, that were not Jewish. That's phenomenal.
This synagogue, I think, is a testament to the community. It needed a community to make this thing occur.
So we came here, found a beautiful reception, a welcoming congregation, and then found out all the stories about what we heard, who they were, where they came from. After World War II, when the significance of the Holocaust was discovered and realized that there were people in the internment camps that were coming to this country, they settled in major cities and didn't have anything to do. And the Hirsch Foundation, Baron Hirsch, had opened up agricultural land, and that's when the families came here, mainly from cities, and became part of the area in northeast Connecticut. And there were families that are here whose parents and grandparents were so grateful to what they did, they helped settle them.
My father was born in Kozlo, Poland, and he was invited when he was the age of 14 to go live with his uncle who lived in Sosnowiec to learn a trade, because my father's uncle was a tinsmith, a welder, basically. And he left the home and he went to Sosnowiec to learn his trade, and that's probably what saved his life in the war, because once they found out he could do that, they put him in the work camps. And he was actually in at least 6 work camps.
My mother was born in Minsk, in Russia. My father was from Poland, Baranovich area. My father was the leader of a partisan group during the war. That's where he met my mother, actually, was in the woods in Poland. And my father had lost his first wife and son in the Holocaust. And my mother had lost her first husband and 2 sons in the Holocaust.
My father was born and raised in a southeastern suburb of Warsaw in Siedlec, Poland, and he was able to get to the partisans through walking and roaming through the woods for 3 weeks after his town had experienced 3 roundups. My mother was raised in the city. She was in what is now Belarus, and the town of Baranovich, and she was able to find her way to this group in the woods. She was part of the family organization of the group. My father went between the family and the fighter organization of the group, and they met in the woods. And as the story my father would say is, he needed somebody to cook for him, and my mother had a pot. So coupling in this way, which was not particularly romantic, but out of necessity, happened with great frequency.
My mother was from a small town in Poland. It was called Janov Poleski. As a matter of fact, my mother's town, they were invaded twice, and they killed off the entire Jewish population except for my mother. She was left with a lot of scars, physical and mental, emotional. She walked around for the rest of her life with a bullet in her lung. My father, he went off on his own and he just started trying to protect the town, and he joined the partisans and all these different groups that were trying to survive the Holocaust. Both of them were in the woods. My mother was bleeding and my father rescued her. He saved her from bleeding to death, and he nursed her back to health, and they hid in the woods.
What a lot of people don't know that my dad told me is that the Nazis had made plans to exterminate everybody at Buchenwald days before Patton came in. The inmates took over the camp, they assassinated a lot of the Nazi guards, and they were waiting with open arms for Patton to come in.
My dad volunteered to fight in World War II, and he was inducted and soon became a sharpshooter. He arrived in Normandy about a month after the invasion. He was part of the 4th Armored Division, and it was that division that went into the Battle of the Bulge. And then, as we found out years later, that it was also the 4th Armored Division that discovered the very first concentration camp and liberated that camp, what was left of it. After he had passed away, we found out that he had his share of run-ins with people that gave him a hard time about being Jewish. But the one thing that we also learned was that if you were a soldier, everyone was fighting the same enemy. Everybody was watching each other's backs. So whatever else happened, they were able to separate that out from who the enemy was.
My father was actually in at least 6 work camps before the final camp, which was Allach, which was a sub-camp of Dachau. And at that point, he was ill. He had some sort of typhus, a fever. His weight was dropping. He was only about 90 pounds at that point. And I think if he had been there another week, he would have been dead. And that's what he says. But he was liberated. He calls that his birthday. His date of liberation was his birthday.
My dad never talked about the war when we were kids. We knew that he had nightmares often of the war, but there was never any open conversations or discussions.
The nightmares that he would have from what he saw when he liberated the camp, was one of the liberators in the camp. You know, nobody should ever have to go through that, just as nobody should ever have to go through what the survivors went through.
My dad was a really tough guy. He grew up in Providence. He was a Renaissance man in many ways. He played in the Rhode Island Junior Philharmonic. He played violin. He was a wrestler. He was a boxer. He was a very good boxer. He was a Depression-era born kid who grew up by his bootstraps. It was years later after he died that one of the survivors, who was a member of the congregation here, his name was Herman Shepard, he told me about my dad's service during the war, and from what I understand, my dad confided in him at the time about his being part of the unit that discovered the first camp and the horrors of what it was that they found. And that was when I first started beginning to understand why so many of the survivors had this connection with my dad and some of the other soldiers that were part of the congregation.
I think the fact that the founders were veterans and also Holocaust survivors, and they were part of the community. We knew people here who had tattoos on their arms and knew the stories of them surviving death camps. And as a small child, my father would tell me where he had a key for a safety deposit box. He also told me where he kept, some money stashed in the basement rafters. And I used to think he was a paranoid man. But to me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, World War II was ancient history. To him, it was fresh in his mind, and it could happen again. So I think that made this temple and this congregation and even my generation that followed those who founded it, keenly aware that it's a legacy and a lesson worth preserving.
So it's sort of interesting about my dad's suitcase. He has his original name on there, which is Chaim Shapurka. which is his Jewish Polish name. My father gave me that suitcase a number of years ago and said, "This is a suitcase that I brought to America," and he came here alone as a young man with all his hopes and all his dreams. And that suitcase really represents everything that he had, all his potential, all his dreams about the Golden Medina, that land filled with milk and honey, an opportunity to be something, not to be spat upon or crucified because you were a Jew, a better place, a good place. But that suitcase was everything that he had in this world, and he kept it all these years.
My mother decided that she did not want to go to Palestine, which was ironic given that she was so Zionistic. And they were sponsored by a family member, and they came through Ellis Island, New Year's Day of 1951. Then they found through one of the members of their partisan group lived on the state line of Connecticut and Rhode Island, and they went to visit them. And at that point, the friend, Lazar Siegel, of blessed memory, said to my dad, also of blessed memory, "You know, if you come and become a wholesale egg farmer like me, you can live an independent life." So my parents came to Foster, Rhode Island, where they bought a small farm. And I remember my mother saying, "Where have you brought me?" All that was around her were tall grasses and fields, and it was a very hard life.
My parents were David and Shirley Rosenberg, and they were founders of Temple Beth Israel. My mom came from New Bedford, Mass, and my dad came from Providence, Rhode Island. And after the war in 1950, they decided on settling in Danielson to raise a family, to start a family business, which is still here today, Danielson Surplus Sales. And our family has had an unbroken connection to this community now for the past 67 years.
It wasn't until 1950 when Holocaust survivors started to buy chicken farms. They got funding from the Jewish Agricultural Society. They really never discussed their experiences, but looking back now, to think that they were ready to start a brand new life, start a family, help building this temple, which is now in the Connecticut and the National Registers of Historic Places. And the community spirit, as people say, Yankee country, they welcomed the Holocaust survivors with open arms.
And it was a rural life, growing up on a chicken farm. And what was interesting was the camaraderie and the cohesiveness of the chicken farmers and the Jewish chicken farmers, who really helped build the temple and build the community. You know the term, it takes a village? And that's really what the community was like. It was a village, and everybody looked out for everyone else. And the people were able to come alive again after the war, especially the immigrants, the Holocaust survivors. And so it was, looking back on it, it was a very interesting dynamic of how they came together, and they really became everyone's extended family because the people had lost so many people in the Holocaust.
When my father came in 1952, they found this farm in Plainfield, but they were $500 short for the purchase price. And he called his lawyer in Norwich, it was Milton Jacobson. Milton called up his friend C. Stanton Gallup. He told Mr. Gallup the story of my father, how he was a Holocaust survivor, wanted to come to Plainfield and buy this farm. C. Stanton Gallup went to his church, had a collection and on it, to help my father, and he got the $500 from the Baptist church.
Dad was very entrepreneurial and went into a lot of businesses, but farming was a little bit easier. He didn't want to be in the city. He'd been crowded in the concentration camps. He'd been in the bunks sleeping with 5 people across, so he was a little bit claustrophobic. He wanted open air. He didn't want to sit inside a factory.
My parents came over on the USS Ernie Pyle into New York, and Dad went to work in the sweatshops there. and he heard about this program called the Jewish Agricultural Society, a fellow named Benjamin Miller. So they went to see what it was like, and they took a ride out here to Eastern Connecticut. They were one of the first, actually, to come to this area. They were the early ones.
I grew up on a dairy farm, a pretty good size operation. My father had built it up, having started the farm. We were milking about 150 head at its peak. In the summertime when we didn't have school, you know, we would help with the haying. My sisters, one of them would help my mother raise the calves. Another one did mostly work in the house. You know, we all chipped in, did what we could.
We actually had 52 acres of land. We had some land in Rhode Island, some in Connecticut. And it had about 5,000 chickens. In '57, he built another coop on the Connecticut side. And then after that, he built another addition to that coop and a new house in Connecticut. And by the end, he had over 20,000 chickens. So he made a pretty good living.
At one point, my father installed a milking parlor, which was very high-tech for its day. He did certain things with conservation in his fields, and he actually won an award. I think it was in 1967, he was named the Conservation Farmer of the Year in Windham County. I mean, not a big deal in Windham County, but that's a big deal for somebody who really wasn't a farmer.
As the congregation grew in size and the farmers would come together, you know, much like Sunday church you see on TV in the old shows in the Midwest, that type of thing, they came together and it was a gathering place. And so services were going on, but they were always talking about chickens and the health of the chickens.
These guys come to a new country. They learn the country's language. They don't ask the country to learn their language. They say, we're going to learn yours. Number two is, what was their education by the time the war hit? 5th grade, 4th grade, 6th grade? Now you come to a different country with a different language and you run a business? Think about that. And you're successful in a business? That's mind-boggling.
Well, we did have Friday night services at home, and within a 35-mile radius, there might be 10 Jewish men. And the old days, the Orthodox, they only count men as part of their minion 10, but now we count 10 women are equal, and so they're counted. So I used to have to go and knock on doors and everything for the holidays, and we had them at our house, the services. My father and mother had brought a Torah back from Norwich.
Over time, they were meeting and having services and high holidays, you know, in somebody's house, and they all decided that they should, you know, get together and maybe we'll build our own synagogue.
My grandparents were not refugees, my mother's parents, but they were, I believe, the only Jews in town, so they also needed a place to worship along with all the refugees that came from Europe. So and they all came together along with non-Jewish business people to help to make it happen. And fast forward to today, I think that if people could all get along that well, then it would be absolutely wonderful.
My husband was very involved. He bought the land, and the people who owned the land said, we have 2 parcels, we're not selling one without the other. So my husband bought both parcels, so just one to the temple, and then we had one which we later sold when we moved away from Danielson.
I remember my mom talking about people coming up to her, because she would work in the store with my dad, or if she was on the street, and handing her $1. This is for the temple.
So in the late 40s, when the synagogue movement to have it built came together, my grandfather decided it would be a good idea to donate a calf. And at the auction, that was a livestock auction that took place in Middletown. And so as the story goes, the calf probably would have produced $25, $30, $35 would have been a market value in those days. And Mr. Cohn purchased it for $65 that day, which was a large sum, and it got a little bit of buzz, and there was a little bit of media.
What's nice about that, aside from it being a nice story, is that it imprints in, when I was a child, people like me, that you are sort of beholden to a larger population, and that we can all help each other out. It's not a matter of just helping in one silo, this group or that group or whatever, but you have a larger sense of responsibility because other people have helped you, or folks before you that have helped create, in this case, the synagogue.
It could not have been built just by Jewish money, and it couldn't have just been built by those that were here originally or those survivors that came in. It needed a community to make this thing occur.
And what was stunning was that the churches, the banks, the community centers, the civic leaders, the school, I mean, everybody said, what a great idea. There are these immigrants, they're just off the boat, and we're going to help them. We'll give them money. We'll give them loans. We will welcome them. A stunning contrast, I think, to what we're encountering these days. I mean, especially for me and for, if my parents were alive today, they would say, oh my God, isn't this different from how we were received?
We have a wonderful editorial written about my mother and how, even though she was Orthodox, how she was so acceptant of everyone and put herself out. And my father became, he was a World War I veteran, and he was commander of the American Legion, and they got the first ambulance, and he was president of the Danielson Industrial Foundation, and he was on the Day-Kilmer Hospital Board of Trustees, he was on the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, you name it, his name as chair.
He had a life here at the synagogue, but he also had a life in the town of Plainfield. He became very involved in politics. He was on the town Democratic Committee. And because he was on the town Democratic Committee, he wanted my mother to be on the town Democratic Committee. So she joined, you know, she came along for the ride. He became a member of the Finance Board, the Board of Finance. They set the budgets every year for the town. He became a member of 2 school building committees. He would go visit the legislators and probably lobbied for whatever.
A list of all the organizations my father had joined, you know, is like a shopping list. It's just, you know, blood drives, Lions Club, I forgot it was Rotary or the Elks Club. So he joined a lot of civic organizations, professional organizations, served at the temple, I think, in at least a half a dozen positions.
My father was much more interested in the outside world. He had many American friends, made a lot of friends in the outside community, and really straddled both worlds. His father was active in the community and acted as a cantor for the prisoners, for the Jewish prisoners, was very active in the orphanage and was well known in the community. And my dad really took after him because when he came to America, he had the same sort of attitude. Very close to the VFW, very close to the veterans, raised a lot of money for them, worked with them, and actually before he became ill, wanted to set up some specialized housing for the veterans because they were so special to him.
My parents, as I mentioned, were showing the signs of the trauma. I mean, there was a lot of quiet time. There was a lot of, you know, just silence. There were a lot of empty spaces. And so to come out of that suddenly, you know, the word was, oh, we're going to the temple. What's the temple? I have no idea. And I come to this place where I hear for the first time other people speaking Yiddish. And I hear laughter, and I hear energy, and I hear animation. And then I see my parents engaged with the other people. So for me, it was stunning. It was like, oh, there can be another kind of life. There can be another kind of experience that's not this silent, isolated, hunkered down, sad experience.
There's something about this place that just calls you back. It's here. It's here, but it's here.
Growing up in that synagogue was very different than growing up in other synagogues. We did not have a rabbi who supported us, but so many of the people who were immigrated from Eastern Europe knew Hebrew very well and were very learned. And so it was a lay leadership. It was always that environment of, camaraderie and caring for each other.
I remember the unbelievably wonderful scents and smells of the women cooking in the kitchen. And it's a small kitchen, didn't matter. Setting things up for various events that were going on here. My mom was very involved with the sisterhood. My mother was secretary for a number of years, and they did all sorts of activities. They did fashion shows, they did hat shows, they did lessons, not necessarily as a sisterhood, but as a group of women who were interested in painting. They would go together and have paintings done. As a matter of fact, the Tree of Life that was done by, I believe her name is Alida Crisella, she was the teacher. And there's a number of pieces of art here that she had done.
My father started this interfaith Thanksgiving dinner and prayer service 60 years ago, and it has been meeting continually since that time, and I didn't know that. I knew he did that years ago, but that's his legacy, to reach out to these other faith communities, because he really firmly believed that building these bridges is essential for our people to live in harmony.
I love the actual architecture of the synagogue because it's partially modern, and that's part of what got it into the registry, but also it has classic sort of homey features of stone and wood that make you feel at home. And yet, it is modern and progressive. You're moving forward. There's plenty of glass, so you feel openness at the same time. It's an archway. You feel a cathedral component, which you feel spiritual in that regard. But it is warm and inviting, which I think is fantastic, rather than imposing or overwhelming. I think the nature of the architecture, probably why it won a number of different awards, etc., is that. It combines the history and the culture with a sense of moving forward.
It's a community that at its height had 70 families. It had a functioning Hebrew school. It had a very active social calendar. So it was a real community center because within a fairly close radius, you had many, many Jewish people who were members. Now you've got 3 or 4 families that are in the area. And so how do you do a Jewish community without Jews?
But they all said they were going to come.
They sent me, in response again to the Yisker book,
We were down to just a handful of families. Now as adults, we understood the importance of saving the history and passing it on to future generations, and not just Jewish families, but the greater interfaith community.
We needed to save the building. We needed to ensure that this building was here. And Joel just got the ball rolling.
I reached out to a group of families who grew up here, along with other friends in the area who had moved to this area years later.
People drove in. People drove in from Massachusetts, from Rhode Island, from other parts of Connecticut, and we met.
And through a series of heart-to-heart conversations about the reality of, would we be able to save this synagogue? Would it be a congregation in the future, or would it be something else? And ultimately, from across the country, and including Israel, we were able to put together a group of about 20 individuals who agreed that if we formed a new nonprofit as a historical preservation society, that in fact we would be able to save this building. We would be able to tell the stories of the old congregation, but just as important, we would be able to have a new cause to teach lessons about the Holocaust and to try to educate children and adults about the importance of learning how to live together.
It still has a role to play in history. My mom helped get it into the National Registry, no accident. Part of it was the architecture, part of it was that it was a home for Holocaust survivors, but it is something larger. Whether it's something spiritual, whatever you want to call it, there's something that draws you to it because it had such an imprint on you. And you know it's something you need to contribute to keep that spirit alive, to help others.
One of the mandates in Jewish tradition is tikkun olam, repair the world. You know, it's part of each Jew's responsibility to actually go out and try to make life better for people around it, for the community, for the world at large. So if that building can become a place where that lesson is taught, and then every now and then we can say, by the way, we got this from the founders. There's a history of the Holocaust here. There's a history of what happens when you don't try to repair the world. What happens, what are the consequences when you don't step up, when you don't speak out, when you see something bad happening?
Erica Wendo's mom, Ray, is 102 years old, and she was giving talks. She went to schools. She would be an active participant in what was going on with the Preservation Society. So, you know, you don't want to let people like that down. You want to keep going. You want to say, yes, okay, we can do this. We can make sure that it continues.
So I see it more and more as ecumenical, a wonderful building, a wonderful story to be told. Working together, whether it's your immediate family, the community, the state, the nation, working together to help support each other, what each other needs. I think that's critical, and being concerned about others, about other people's problems.
It's our responsibility to try and maintain both educating other people and new generations of folks to learn about not only our experience as being children of Holocaust survivors, but also what a community does to accept other people.
For those of us that grew up in this synagogue, our parents would be incredibly proud of what we've carried on. It's no longer a congregation, but they'd be proud of what we're doing in trying to promote tolerance, and I think they'd be pleased to know that the synagogue doors are still open a few times a year, and that our message is as relevant today as it was when they first built this synagogue.
Now that most of those survivors are gone, and there's a handful left, somebody's got to tell the story, especially with what goes on in the world today. Somebody's got to tell the story.
If we can have something, call it a museum, call it an educational site, call it whatever, but a place where this history is known and people go, wow, look at these pictures, look at this, huh. And if it just gets one person to think, then we've done well. We've done well.